G'day guys, and welcome to Phil and Jen in the Philippines, another vlog from the Philippines, and a little bit different today. I'll see how this goes and see if you want any more of it and whatever, but Jen suggested to me while we're talking about subjects for the vlog that possibly people would like to know a little bit about both Jen and I and our past lives and how we ended up, or how I ended up in the Philippines, and give you some idea of my background and whatever. And I thought the best way to do that is to tell you some stories of my adventures in Southeast Asia and Australasia and whatever over different sections of my life, and you can draw your own conclusions. Now, before we even start, I'll tell you a lot of what I'm going to show you today as far as photos are concerned are not the original actual photographs of my time in Papua New Guinea. They're taken off the net, but they're specifically used for examples only, and they're the closest thing I could get off the net to illustrate the point that I'm trying to talk about today. So as you can appreciate, my talk is this time on an adventure I had, for want of a better word, in Papua New Guinea a number of years ago, and all these things combined probably gave me enough courage to eventually decide to live in Asia, or at least a foreign country. I didn't know at the time that that's what it was leading up to, but I'll go ahead with it anyway. As I said, it was a number of years ago, probably closer to 20, that I went to Papua New Guinea for about the third or fourth time. I'll tell you the background to it, and it may be a long story. I may have to carve this up into 2 videos, and I'll get your responses to see, even if you're interested in seeing the second half of it. But as you're aware, or may not be aware, most of my life, as far as employment was concerned, was to do with the legal profession. As a police officer, in an emergency services operator, a prosecutor, a lawyer, corrective services. So you can basically see that for a great percentage of my lifetime I've dealt with criminals, but that has its ups and downs, and any copper that's been in the job for a period of time will tell you that in the old days, not so much these days, but law and order and criminality was viewed a little bit differently, and professional crims, as we often came upon them, it was their job to be criminals, and it was our job to put them away. And the more interaction you had with these people, yes, you had people that hated our guts and whatever, but there was certain criminals that you had a begrudging admiration for to a certain degree. They're usually charismatic people, especially if they're involved in what we call very loosely organised crime, or they're an upper echelon of criminal. And you do run across them, and it becomes almost a game. Well, years drag on, and the crims and the coppers get old, and from time to time your paths cross outside the law and order type thing. And this is what happened to me after I got out of the police and after I got out of prosecution. Sorry about that, Jen just needed something, and so I had to go and attend to that. As I was saying, one such criminal, and let's call him a colourful gambling and racing identity. And for all you Aussies and Kiwis out there, you'll know exactly what that phrase means. I had a lot to do with, both when I was in the job and a little bit to do with on the outside of the job. In my later career, I had gleaned the reputation of a bit of a gun for hire, and I don't mean shooting people. I mean in a corporate sense, or a Mr. Fix-It type situation, especially when it came to overseas assignments. Now, I'm not suggesting to anyone that I'm big-headed enough to say that I was good at it. I was probably hired on a number of occasions because I was the only one stupid enough to take the job. But they usually paid well, and therefore that was my motivation for undertaking the jobs that I did. One such job was with this colourful racing identity. He called me up out of the blue, and he explained to me on the phone that he had business interests business interests in Papua New Guinea and explained those business interests. And at first I wasn't interested at all until he convinced me, and with a little bit of research I found out that his business interests were, at this stage of his life, 100% legitimate. Still a little bit dicey, and still doing things that he did in Australia, but now he did it legally. He was involved in the gaming hotel industry, and he was involved in New Guinea with poker machines and gambling. Now, what I think of those enterprises is irrelevant. He wanted me, he was in a bind, and he wanted me to attend to one of his hotels because he knew I had hotels in Australia, and he knew I was au fait with the hotel business. And he wanted to employ me because he'd had trouble with both being extorted money by employees in Papua New Guinea, and one of his major managers at one of his most profitable casino hotels had disappeared, had flown the coop, had enough and run amok and decided to leave. The problem was, when he called me, it was just after Christmas and we were leading up to New Year. I wasn't really interested. I wanted to spend that period of time with my family. And, you know, he continued to make offers. In the end, I couldn't refuse, which is an old cliched thing from The Godfather. But yes, he'd made me a financial offer I couldn't refuse. And because of his contacts in Papua New Guinea, he arranged my visa, my working visa, to go to Papua New Guinea, and off I went. For a period of no more, according to this colourful racing identity, of 1 month, until we got over the Christmas period and he could implant another employee into this casino. He needed someone that he may not have liked, but he knew I was honest and he could trust me. So I took up the position. Why not? Papua New Guinea, I hadn't been there for a long time, and off I went. Well, I arrived in Port Moresby, hot, stinking climate, and things had changed tremendously since I'd been there last. Port Moresby airport was hot and sweaty and busy, and the air conditioning was going in sound only but not in cold air, and it wasn't a great impression I got. But anyway, my accommodation had been paid for. I gave that accommodation address to a taxi driver who was to transport me to what was then known as the expats compound. And up the hill we went. I wasn't recognising too much because everything had changed so much since I'd been there last. I was sitting in the back seat of the taxi, and the Papuan taxi driver was driving. We got out halfway up the hill, and as he rounded the corner, much to my chagrin, all of a sudden the driver ducked below the seat. Now I immediately panicked and thought, what the hell's going on? We're driving about 35, 40 kilometres an hour, and the driver's ducked down onto the seat. I thought he must have had some kind of heart attack. And as I leaned over the seat to see if I could assist him, you know, I suddenly realised that there was gunshots coming from left and right side of the taxi as I went up the hills. I, of course, hit the deck as fast as I could until the gunshots abated and he no longer was in danger, so he popped his head up and we continued with our journey. Rather an eye-opener, and welcome to Papua New Guinea. Well, we got to the compound and I was to fly out the next day, back to the airport of course, on the way to Goroka in the highlands. And I'll put some maps in and you can see where Goroka is. It is in a very high area in Papua New Guinea, and in those days it was very difficult to get to. We used to fly in and fly out. I'll never forget, as I waited at the airport for a relatively small plane to take off and take me to Goroka through New Guinea Airways, I noticed two Papuans in really badly fitting uniforms walk across the lounge and head towards our aircraft. I have to admit, I hoped and prayed that what they were the flight attendants. But again, looking at these guys, and I'm probably prejudiced and I'll admit the fact, you know, the guys went up the gangway, through the plane, and then plonked themselves in the pilot and co-pilot seat, and I can't say it any other way, that's when I started to shit myself. But anyway, we got to Goroka after taking off. And I know that sounds terrible, but it was It was my thing. All I could see was this plane hurtling towards a mountain somewhere. But as I said, we got there. At this stage, it is New Year's Eve. And a Papuan guy that was employed by the hotel picked me up at the airport and drove me in a four-wheel drive out to a compound to a place called the Lucky Money House. It was perched on about 4 acres and surrounded by 10 to 12 foot concrete walls with rolled barbed wire on the top, and it almost had a castle-like appearance as far as the gates were concerned. Behind those gates were a converted motel, raised on stilt legs, and underneath where the stilt legs used to be for air to circulate, they had plonked probably 150 poker machines and gaming machines, and above that was then the offices and the accommodation. I couldn't help but notice that everything, there was guards everywhere, you know, armed to the teeth with shotguns, not uniformed, and it was rather a scene out of something you'd expect in a film, in deepest, darkest, drug-filled Colombia or something to that effect. But anyway, I pressed on regardless. I was introduced to the staff. It was getting late in the day. I didn't really know too many people. Their English wasn't very good. I didn't speak good pidgin. So therefore, I went upstairs and was introduced to my bedsitter style of room. To get there, I had to go up, undo 3 or 4 locks. Even the balconies were covered in razor wire and barbed wire, which, you know, is a little bit confronting when you look at it. But anyway, I made my way in, and I made myself comfortable by unpacking. It wasn't too long as the sun was going down that a ruckus occurred, and from my room, I noticed that from my balcony, across the road and over the 11, 12-foot fences, I could see a rather large crowd gathering. A crowd of native guys, obviously, and there was some kerfuffle going on. So I continued to watch, and then I realised that there were people involved in a fight, a melee in the middle of this armed crowd. And there was probably 200, 250 people milling around the service station, which was a Shell service station across the road, and becoming noisier and noisier. And they were all watching this battle that was going on in the middle. Now, I don't know why, I suppose my sense of superiority, I screamed at the top of my lungs for these guys to disperse, you know, to piss off. Probably one thing, they were making a huge amount of noise, and the second thing was that, you know, people were going to get injured. Much to my surprise, they all looked towards the balcony of which I was standing on beyond the gates. And it wasn't too long that they started to scream, obviously, obscenities back at me in pidgin. Then, even in a shorter period of time, the gunfire started. Then I realised that they were firing at me, and there was holes in the side of the hotel and whatever. So of course I dived back into the room and under the bed. And there I laid while the gunfire and the noise went on New Year's Eve in that particular year. The interesting thing was I couldn't understand where security was. I later found out that, you know, they'd also joined the crowd, and this is what happens in Papua New Guinea. You can't rely on security. But anyway, there I was, 6'2", trying to be as flat as I possibly could on the floor as periodic and spasmodic gunfire came through the hotel, and no one was coming to my assistance. In that position, as it got later and later, I eventually fell asleep because I wasn't getting out from underneath that bed for love and bloody money. And I woke up the next day. I tentatively got out from underneath the bed and wandered around the room, peeked out the window, and realised the crowd had dispersed. I then went out onto the balcony to see what I could see and see the aftermath of what occurred the night before. To my surprise, to the sight that befell me, and remember this, I'd just come from New South Wales, from Sydney. Here was some guy's head on the top of the Bowser that these guys had cut off during this melee, and there it sat, staring at the hotel. This was my introduction to what was obviously at this stage of the game a wild and woolly place in Papua New Guinea. Now we went on If you want to hear anything more about this, because it does go on, and I had some victories and eventual disasters there, but if you like this type of story, I'm only too happy to tell you. If not, at least you know I was in Papua New Guinea. Have a look at, I believe there are some press releases on what I'm telling you to verify what I'm saying, but they were wild and woolly days. And that's why, to a certain degree, coming to a place like the Philippines doesn't seem that big a deal to me. But if you want to hear more, comment, subscribe, thumbs up, and I'm sure Jen's preparing her stories about when she was in the Middle East and what she actually did and how she attained the positions that she attained and what she found good about the Middle East and UAE and other places she'd visited. If you want to know more about us, if you want to know more about our background, subscribe, thumbs up, give us a comment. Only too happy to pass it on. Cheers for now, guys.